I was a senior in high school, actually. I remember I was getting ready to go to school, and I walked into the kitchen where the news was on, like my mom had it on every morning. And it was just after the first plane had crashed into the first tower. And so I was thinking, oh my gosh, this is terrible, what a horrible tragedy, you know? And I watched as the second plane flew into the second tower. And at that moment, I don't think anyone had any question about this being an accident. It was clear that it was deliberate. Like, things like that don't happen by accident. And I remember going to school that day, and all we did the whole day was kind of just sit around and watch the news and talk a little about what was happening. People were, in shock. It understandably was a huge thing. And so certainly right then and there it had a big impact on us. For me, it was mostly psychological impact. I didn't know anyone in New York. I'd never been there. I don't have any friends or family that were directly impacted by that. But my dad and my younger brother had actually just been there, like, I guess it was about 6 weeks prior. They'd been standing right there, where all this happened. So I think for them it felt very real in that sense. And looking at the bigger picture, like this was an event that shaped my generation in a lot of ways. I mean, 9/11, the events of 9/11 eventually led to the war on terror, which led to the decision to invade Afghanistan, looking for the Taliban. My dad's in the military; he's been in the reserves since before I was born. And in the time I've been teaching at Monte Vista, during the last 5 years, my dad's been deployed 3 times, twice overseas. So he spent the better part of 3 years away from his family. Maybe not as a direct result of 9/11, but certainly partially caused by that. I mean, he wouldn't have been deployed to Afghanistan like he was the first time if that hadn't happened. So I feel like that's had a real big impact on, not just on my generation overall, but on me personally. And I think of all the other little things too. I mean, like airport security, it didn't used to be anything like what it is. We didn't have full body scanners. We didn't have, really intense searches. We didn't have all of the random people being stopped. That's different. I feel like in a lot of ways since 9/11, we've kind of had to get used to trading some of our privacy for security, or the feeling of security. I recall being stuck in San Francisco airport, which if you've ever flown in or out of there, I'm sure has happened to you at some point because of weather. And while I was there was the same family that I didn't know them. I don't know what religion they were. They looked Middle Eastern, and as a result, every time we had to go through security again, they would get randomly pulled out again. I watched it happen 3 times over the course of like the 4 or 5 hours. I was waiting there, getting transferred to different flights and things like that. It was the beginning of my senior year, so if you put it in perspective in that sense, like it absolutely changed things. I think it helped us to realize that there were bigger things than just us in the world, which sometimes you kind of lose track of when you're so busy doing all of your things and applying for college and thinking about your future. I think it made me aware of this whole portion of the world that I'd never really given much thought to. I mean, prior to 9/11, like, your average American teenager probably couldn't tell you where Afghanistan was, much less tell you anything about it. So yeah, it definitely had an impact in terms of that. And I think it made us feel less safe. If somebody could, kill thousands of people in an American city, what's to stop something like that from happening to me or you or anybody else? So yeah, I think, psychologically it gave us that feeling that, hey, maybe I'm not as safe here as I think I am. But I think this had a profound impact on my generation because to the same way that 9/11 made us question how safe we really were in the US, in cities here and things like that, Columbine made us question how safe we really were at school, someplace where we spend tons of our time. And it changed a lot of things. Prior to Columbine, we didn't have code red drills. They didn't exist. Nobody was worried about that. So I recall being in high school and being told for the first time what we should do during a code red drill. And honestly, I was upset about it. I didn't think that it would do much to protect us, and I felt like all it was doing was perpetuating that fear, reminding us that, hey, you're not really safe here and we can't really protect you. I think as an adult and as one, as a teacher and somebody who sees kind of the other end of it, like I see why we do things like that, and I understand the value in doing them. But definitely as a teenager at the time, it was something that was really scary. I remember a friend of mine who he would regularly dress in a black trench coat. He went to another high school in the area, and a mutual friend of ours, and you know, we talked and we were both really concerned about this other guy who wore the trench coat. We're like, I hope he knows not to wear that tomorrow. Like, I hope he understands that regardless of your fashion statement, regardless of being an individual or anything else, that, you know, the day after Columbine, you don't show up dressed like those guys did. So, you know, that had an impact on me, on my friends. It changed the school culture, and it, you know, just, again, had that effect of making us feel less safe.
So
The whole notion of Code Red and the idea of shelter in place, like all of that came about really after Columbine when people were trying to deal with this. It also sparked or helped to continue a lot of the anti-bullying stuff that we're seeing now for different reasons. I mean, people like the Columbine shooters were outcasts. They were the kids that, you know, that were picked on and everything else. And while it doesn't excuse in any way what they did, I think it helped adults to realize, hey, maybe we should pay more attention to what's going on in the halls. Maybe we should try to help kids to, you know, to look out for one another. And as somebody who's been trained to be a teacher, yeah, I mean, there were a lot of times when we spent time talking about those sorts of situations, how to counsel kids. I remember taking an ed psych class where we looked at how to, you know, students who might be having different sorts of issues or feeling left out, and, you know, kind of the negative consequences of that. So I think it heightened awareness too for students who might be facing the sorts of problems that those two were. I always imagined or would like to believe that we would have a president of color. I just didn't figure it would happen so soon. I kind of joked that I thought my grandparents would be dead, which I mean no disrespect to my grandparents or anyone else's, but my thought is I just didn't believe that the older generations would be willing to accept and to support an African American president. But I was really proud of my country when we did. When, you know, for the majority of Americans, that didn't seem to be the deciding factor. When, you know, that was one of those moments where I felt really proud to be an American, and where it felt like a lot of the stuff that we're told growing up, like you can be anything you want, may have actually had some truth to it. So I think that a lot of people in my generation felt the same way. Yeah, we were young and kind of idealistic and about that, and perhaps didn't have the perspective to understand quite, you know, what was going on. But I mean, I think of the way that that's going to shape us, you know, as we're entering our careers and as we're getting started as professionals and everything else. We're seeing, hey, here's you know, somebody who didn't exactly have the greatest upbringing or all the opportunities that you might expect, who's at a disadvantage in some ways because of the way that others might perceive him because of his race, and look what he accomplished. I think it's going to have a profound effect for your generation and for my kids, you know, and that they're brought up in a world where that matters a whole lot less. Yeah, I mean, and, you know, we're a country that for hundreds of years has grappled with race relations and the way that we've tried to deal with our past. You know, what's the proper reaction to something like slavery? This huge deal. Sure, it's over, but does that mean that all of the consequences of that disappear? Absolutely not. But people are uncomfortable talking about it. And really, what do? You know, you look similarly at the interactions of a lot of the European settlers with a lot of the Native Americans. Like, there were some pretty horrible things that happened, and I think, generally speaking, people acknowledge that now. But again, what do you do about that? You know, and so in some ways, I think if nothing else, symbolically, this was sort of a victory, saying that, hey, in spite of all of the terrible things in our past, like, maybe there's a way to move past that. Maybe there's a way, you know, to come together as Americans to heal, I guess. And when I say growing up with technology, I don't mean that we grew up with everything already there, in the sense that like your generation did. When I think of the internet in particular, that was something that really kind of grew and evolved with us. To give you an example, when I was little, I remember getting a dial-up internet connection in our house for the first time. It was really cool. We were able to play text-based games. You actually had to type stuff in. I remember getting to middle school, and at that point, we actually had instant messaging, which was like a brand new thing, which is, of course, perfect for middle schoolers, right? You get home from school and you can still talk to your friends. I remember being in college when Facebook came out. Like, a lot of or when it became a big deal, I guess. A lot of those things I felt kind of coincided with where I was in my life, and now, you know, I'm a little bit older, I'm a professional and everything else, and everyone has access to the internet on their phones all the time, which is really helpful from a professional standpoint, aside from all the other cool things that it can do. So I feel like my generation has grown up alongside the internet, which kind of gives us the benefit of understanding what it means to not have that technology, but also not being at the disadvantage that some older generations are of not understanding the technology itself, because it's kind of grown along with us.
do you think